I think we should just go through these ideas quickly one more time. Society is structured by systems of power which uphold privilege and marginalisation. These include patriarchy, white supremacy, imperialism, heteronormativity, the assumption that people are heterosexual, cisnormativity, the assumption that one's gender identity matches one's reproductive system, ableism, and fat phobia. People are positioned within these power structures by their identity, race, gender, sexuality, and more. They are then either enabled to succeed or hindered from doing so, depending on what that is. There is no objective knowledge or objectively better morality. Due to the socially constructed nature of knowledge, different groups have different knowledges related to their identity. The knowledge of privileged groups is what is accepted as legitimate knowledge. Other knowledge is considered illegitimate, and this is the result of an unjust application of power and nothing to do with accuracy. Because of this, members of dominant groups are unable to see these systems of power or other knowledge systems, but marginalised people often can see more. Knowledge and morality are constructed in this way by discourses, ways of talking about things. Therefore, language is inherently dangerous. Due to the positional nature of knowledge and morality, liberal notions of individuality and humanism are largely myths which perpetuate privilege. This is an alarming and bleak worldview. It seriously undermines any attempts for people to relate to each other as individuals or to recognise their shared humanity. Furthermore, it's unfalsifiable. Because of the belief that privileged people are both unable to see their own privilege and motivated to resist believing in it, any attempts by members of those groups to disagree are already accounted for and dismissed. Nor is it often possible for members of marginalised groups to challenge it. Because of the belief that discourses of power run through everyone, they are just not sufficiently woke to have seen through them. Worse still, they can be accused of trying to curry favour with the powers that be at the expense of more marginalised people. Women like me, who don't believe we live in a patriarchal rape culture, can be subjected to vicious abuse. Gay men have become particularly vulnerable as more and more of them decline to see themselves as oppressed. Black men, too, are now sometimes accused of being the white people of black people. And Asians and Jews, who are more successful statistically on average, have come to be called white adjacent. So this term comes because we have to maintain the idea of whiteness as the magical superpower and white supremacy as the organiser of society. Douglas Murray, in his new book, The Madness of Crowds, relates accounts of people who are being told they weren't really gay, black or feminist because they didn't have the right ideas, they didn't believe the right things. Marginalised identities now require a political commitment to be considered legitimate. What then are we to do? How are we even to begin to address this if all objections are anticipated and rejected in advance? If being allowed to have a legitimate position on any of this relies on having the right identity and the right ideology, there isn't a significant and coherent pushback against this right now. Part of the reason for this is that people don't really understand what's going on or how it works. Their attempts to reason with this belief system have relied on reason, as well as evidence and understanding of individuality, universality, and reciprocity. Treat others as you'd like to be treated. This holds no water in the postmodern conception of the world. My earlier talk attempted to shed a little light on that, and my team and I will continue to try to do so. However, another reason that we're not addressing this successfully right now is that there is no we. The degree of political polarisation is actively preventing us from addressing the problem as it is. We are all speaking languages that are different and embedded in different narratives. This became very clear to me when writing this talk. I am a left-wing, liberal, atheist Remainer, and normally I would be speaking to fellow liberal lefties about how to get our house in order. I am usually working on the assumption that the people I'm talking to want to see a left-wing party worthy of being elected again. Yes, well, some of you do, good. But You might not want that. Those of you who are religious or conservative or religious conservatives may not have the same goals for society that I do. You may not have the same moral intuitions in the same degrees that I do. And nevertheless, I do not believe that you do not also seek social justice. Believing that of each other is essential to being able to overcome the polarisation sufficiently to address this problem. The political polarisation in the US is particularly alarming. Race relations appear to be getting worse, although that might be deceptive. They're certainly volatile. The Me Too movement, intended to embolden women to speak up about sexual assault, has hit ultimate overreach. This significantly impacts gender relations and undermines the validity of its own cause. The LGBT movement is significantly divided on the T issue. Lesbian radical feminists and trans activists are seen to accuse each other of everything from misogyny to murder. The action of Antifa extremists is growing increasingly violent, and meanwhile, National Security Council has advised the President to address far-right extremism urgently. Here in the UK, we see a significant amount of these same problems, though it is less volatile. Most of the polarisation for us is around Brexit, Leavers and Remainers. I'm certainly worried about what Brexit might bring, but I'm more concerned about the effects this polarisation is having on us. We simply cannot make any adjustments we need to make if everybody is invested in having been right and blaming the other side for any problems that arise. We are currently experiencing a war of narratives in which everybody positions themselves on the side of good against evil. To tribal leftists, the right are racist, misogynist imperial demons who want to keep marginalised groups down and secure their own privilege. To tribal rightists, the left are anti-white traitors who hate their own country, want open borders and to transition toddlers. Leavers are gammon-faced populist xenophobes, nostalgic for empire. Remainers are the liberal elite enemies of democracy who sell out their own people. Once people have embedded themselves in any of these narratives, reaching across them becomes almost impossible. And yet it's extremely unlikely that any significant number of people believes themselves to be wanting anything less than the best for their country and social justice. In 2017, James and I wrote our manifesto against the enemies of modernity. These enemies, we argued, were the postmodern left and the pre-modern right. For the postmodernists, the advances of the modern period are a fantasy dreamed up by naive or arrogantly bigoted Enlightenment thinkers. They underestimated the collateral consequences of modernity's progress. For them, the modern period was an overconfident illusion, and they are over it. They are postmodern. The regressive right champions pre-modernism instead. This is little more than a grand delusion that the intricate complexities of modern society can function without the elaborate infrastructure required to run a modern society. For them, modernity was largely a mistake which had subjected humanity to the remote wisdom of various kinds of dubious experts. It had taken them away either from the wisdom of God or from natural law. Both of these are outright rejections of the Enlightenment's commitment to truth. However, these anti-modernists are a minority of people. They are probably comprising only about 15% of the population combined. We argued that the majority of people on both the left and the right continue to value the fruits of modernity. On the level of knowledge and ethics, these modern principles are: objective truth exists, and humans can get closer to it by using evidence and reason. We call this science. Objective truth is, in principle, accessible to everyone and the same for everyone, though different experiences of it exist, and these experiences matter. Language, while occasionally slippery, is generally reliable, and it is how humans can communicate and advance knowledge. Thus, all ideas must be able to be discussed by everyone and challenged by everyone. Principles of secular liberal democracy, human rights, freedoms and opportunity should apply universally. Human nature exists and merits human rights. Universality and individuality are key to a thriving and free society. That is, all rights and responsibilities must apply universally to all people, and all individuals must be free to make their own choices and fulfill their own potential. They must not be constrained in any way by their identity or their collective. These values belong to neither the left nor the right, and people who hold them form a majority. and yet we are so distracted by fighting with each other that we are not defending them from the fanatics on either side. The most common criticism I have had for being a lefty who criticises the left is that I give ammo to the right and undermine my own cause. This makes no sense at all. The argument seems to be, don't draw attention to the problem on your own side, or the other side will notice you have problems. I think they've noticed. In reality, this is just bad psychology. Black and white thinking will not fix this. Automatic defences of social justice because they're on your side will not fix it, nor will knee-jerk reactions against it because it's on the other side. No, the way to fix the social justice problem is to engage with its legitimate concerns, acknowledge them to be so, then point out the flaws with its methods and suggest better ones. This really isn't hard for anybody on the left or the right. We all want social justice. None of us wants a bullying ideology that tells people how to think and threatens their livelihood if they do it wrong. The strength of social justice ideas largely come from the kernel of truth at the root of them. We need to stop thinking that one must come down on the side of core beliefs of social justice or against them. We don't need to claim that no part of social reality is culturally constructed to be critical of social justice ideas, or that there aren't grand narratives that need to be challenged. We don't need to say that people don't hold implicit biases or that language isn't powerful. Clearly, these ideas have validity. The problem is where we go from here. Given the choice of believing that culture strongly influences what a society accepts as true, or believing that it has no impact, rational people who value evidence and reason must look around them and conclude that it does. What is erroneous is the idea that recognition of this belongs to the postmodernists or the social justice activists. The rest of us just wander around in comfortable oblivion, waiting for them to make us woke to it. Humans in general have been aware of the existence of culture, the power of narratives, and the tendency of humans to be biased and unaware of it. There is much rigorous scholarship in sociology, social psychology, evolutionary psychology, and neuroscience to tell us this. This existed before social justice, and it now exists alongside it, and is mostly rejected by social justice scholars. Lukianoff and Haidt, Campbell and Manning, V.S. Ramachandran, Steven Pinker, Anne Campbell, Nicholas Christakis, Robert Sapolsky are just a few of the scholars to address these. We don't need social justice activists to explain to us how humans work, and they are the least qualified to do so. To make any kind of balanced and fair critique of social justice, we need to address where they get things right, and then how they go wrong. So let's look at these ideas. Is knowledge a social construct? This question underlies everything else, so requires unpacking carefully. It's also potentially misleading because in one sense it certainly is. Knowledge is the product of knowing. In order to know anything, one must have consciousness. In order to know anything that requires complex thought, one must have language and a big brain. Therefore, knowledge requires humans. Because humans are social animals and social claims become legitimised among a society when there's a consensus it's true, knowledge is a product of society. But is it a construct of society? That is, have we made it up rather than discovered it? Does what we are claiming to be knowledge represent human-made beliefs or an objective reality? For the postmodernists of the late 20th century, and consequently for the social justice activists right now, we can never be sure that we've obtained objective knowledge because cultural influences are so powerful. Therefore, for them, what we are looking at when we see knowledge claims is just something the dominant groups in society have decided is true. Thus, it is to be treated as suspicious on principle. What is interesting and important about this to postmodern thinkers are the power dynamics in play. Who is benefited by this and who is oppressed? It is these power dynamics and cultural assumptions they want to identify and deconstruct. For the empiricists and rationalists, we can never be sure that we've obtained objective knowledge either. This is for a number of reasons, including cultural influences being so powerful. This doesn't require radical skepticism or paranoid power analyses. It requires regarding all knowledge as provisional in principle and to keep finding ways to mitigate error and bias in order to get closer to objective knowledge. These methods include requiring evidence for truth claims and reason in arguments. They require viewpoint diversity and allowing anyone to challenge anything, setting up systems to test, attempts to falsify and replicate knowledge claims. What is interesting and important, it is what is true. But Jim has spoken quite enough about that. Therefore, when we hear the claim that knowledge is a social construct, this is almost never just a claim that knowledge is a product of society, which nobody doubts. What we are usually hearing is radical scepticism that objective knowledge can be obtained and suspicion of the political motivations of those who claim to have obtained it. What is very likely to follow is advocacy of accepting multiple knowledges founded in cultural beliefs and lived experiences and foregrounding those of the historically marginalised. We can reasonably object to that conception of knowledge. It doesn't require denying that culture has profound influence, nor do we need to dismiss the importance of cultural beliefs, perspectives and experiences to the way in which humans find meaning and experience the world. Do grand narratives need to be challenged? Yes, obviously. Grand narratives can be understood as the often moralistic, explanatory stories for how the world or society works. Religion provides the most influential and lasting examples of these, but secular ideologies like nationalism, colonialism, and Marxism also come complete with overarching stories and a simple explanation of problems and solutions. Again, postmodernism did not invent the understanding that uncritically accepting such large overarching narratives is a bad idea. There were some rather significant historical developments called the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, secularism, and the civil rights movements. These all took place before postmodern ideas morphed into social justice scholarship and activism in the late 80s. This work certainly needs to be ongoing forever, as humans' love of stories and simple, neat explanations are probably not going anywhere. But we do not need to do this with postmodern radical scepticism, and we don't need to accept the theoretical and ideological framework of social justice, which is quite clearly now a grand narrative in itself. People who find themselves being told they can either uncritically accept grand narratives, often called accepting the status quo, or subscribe to social justice ideas should feel quite confident in rejecting that false choice. We can doubt the need to dismantle invisible forces of patriarchy, white supremacism, imperialism, heterocentrism, ableism, and fatphobia, and politely decline to heal from our whiteness or detoxify our masculinity. We can instead do what liberals do and reject both the conservative impulse to keep things the same and the radical impulse to turn society on its head. We can seek to reform and improve society by identifying specific injustices and providing evidence that they exist. Then we can make reasoned and principled arguments for ending them and appeal to the predominantly liberal culture's sense of fairness and empathy to bring this about in ways that will work. Imagine that you recognise that the engine of your car has a problem. You find a qualified mechanic to identify the problem and fix it using a method that can actually repair the problem. That is liberalism. Now imagine your car's engine problems mean it is hopeless and pushing it into the Thames before concluding no one should have cars at all and the world would be better off if we'd never invented them. That's postmodernism. Do humans hold biases they might not even be aware of? Yes, of course we do. We're very much products of our time and culture, and we internalise culturally dominant ideas in society as common sense. Michel Foucault was not wrong about that. We don't have to pretend that homosexuality and the rights and roles of women have not been regarded very differently in different times and places. A reading of Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by a woman who was progressive for her time, reveals that she nevertheless held assumptions and biases against black people which are shocking to us now. Social justice activists are absolutely right to warn that we cannot trust we have finally got it right. In the future, people will probably look back at our time and consider some of the things we're doing as deeply immoral in ways that we can't understand now. These scholars and activists are right to say that prejudices don't simply vanish when legal equality is achieved. Much hidden discrimination can continue to exist, which affects the material realities of certain groups in society. They do well to advise us to be introspective about this and examine our own thought process honestly. Unfortunately, this is often not what they advise. Instead, they push adherents to a very specific conception of society and systems of power. And they're becoming more dogmatic, concrete, and actionable over the last 50 years. We must be able to decline to believe that systems of patriarchy, white supremacy, etc., lie beneath the nice, clean-looking surface of secular liberal democracies, or that they pervade everything, popping up in symptoms which can only be detected and translated by those knowledgeable of social justice methods. We can be sceptical that these symptoms are largely invisible to the unenlightened masses, even though they operate through them. We can question the claim that marginalised groups have an advantage in being able to see them, because they have experience of them, by pointing out that this is falsified by marginalised groups being just as ideologically diverse as everyone else. We can reject the claim that members of dominant groups are unqualified to have an opinion on whether any action or speech was racist, sexist, transphobic, especially if it was our own and we know it was not. We can decline to apologise and promise to do better, and instead politely inform the accuser that we're sorry if it appeared to them that way, but we can assure them it was not the case. Essentially, what social justice scholarship and activism does is try to replace one mostly imagined set of ideological biases with its own ideological bias. That is, they have come to understand their own conception of society is objectively true, which the original postmodernists did not. They believe themselves to have a moral imperative to read society through it, detect prejudice everywhere, draw it to the attention of society, and have offenders reprimanded or punished. We must be able to decline to go along with this. We can attempt to suggest to social justice activists and scholars that they might be suffering from confirmation bias and utilising motivated reasoning. And if this is understood by them as evidence that we are the ones who are comfortably ensconced in our own privilege and can't see the truth, we can suggest this is projection and walk away. We don't have to go with the option, insist that oppressive power dynamics are present in every situation and must be identified and called out, and anyone who disagrees is just protecting their own privilege. But neither do we have to race off in the other direction and insist we've already achieved full social justice and are free of prejudice, and anyone who says otherwise is a self-victimising snowflake. We can assert our own ability to see and address social justice issues. If postmodern scholars and activists are able to step outside cultural narratives enough to see them and challenge them, other people can too. We may see some of the same problems they do, and even some of the same solutions, or we may not. History is full of liberals seeing societal injustice and remedying it. Liberals on the right, on the left, and in the centre. It was liberal drives that successfully challenged and overcame feudalism, theocracy, slavery, colonialism, and patriarchy. Before the social justice movement ever emerged, we're not blind to illiberalism in the familiar forms of racism, sexism, homophobia, or ableism, and we can address them. We can also address illiberalism when it calls itself social justice. Of course, when I say we can do these things, I mean that they are reasonable ethical alternatives to either accepting social justice premises or rejecting them. And I'm advocating confidently taking them when you are able. In reality, many of us may not be able to do any of this and still keep our jobs or reputations. That is a material problem that must be addressed alongside the ethical one. The answer to this would appear to be extending the idea of secularism to social justice ideas. That is, we must push for this belief system to be recognised as the equivalent to a religion for freedom of belief purposes. We must insist on the right to say, those are your beliefs and you're entitled to them. I will defend your right to them, to hold them, express them, and apply them to your own life. You must not expect me to hold them, express them, or live according to them. This is basic freedom of speech and belief, and we must allow this to social justice scholars and activists at the same time as insisting they allow them to the rest of us. Is language powerful, dangerous, and hurtful? Of course it is. Humans have long known this. It's how we spread our ideas and our knowledge. Language has produced ideologies that justified the torture, murder, and exploitation of millions. We are a storytelling species, and the stories we tell shape the way we see the world. The way we talk about things really matters. We can incite hatred, violence, paranoia, or fear, or we can urge calm, reason, empathy, and compassion. Humans have always known the power of language, for good or ill. Blasphemy and heresy laws have existed to prevent people from damning themselves or others to hell. Political dissidents have been tortured or murdered to silence them. The desire to control language to control society is not new. Needless to say then, postmodernists did not invent the idea that language is powerful and potentially dangerous. Freedom of speech is a relatively new concept to human civilization. It gradually developed in Western liberal democracies over the modern period in order to push back those influential powers which would seek to control speech. The church, the monarchy, the state. Social justice is another manifestation of power, and it will have to give up hopes of control too. Nor did social justice activists introduce the idea that language can hurt. No one who has ever lived in a society or cared about other people can doubt this. We have been wounding each other with words forever. The children's rhyme, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me, would not exist if we did not have to train ourselves into tolerating upsetting language. The idea that words can be violent seems hyperbolic, but it makes intuitive sense to anyone who's ever experienced words so hurtful they feel they'd rather have been punched in the face. The postmodern idea of discourses, which constructs social reality, is not without merit. For anyone reading how women, racial minorities, and homosexuals have been spoken about historically, it is clear that horrible ideas have been spread by language and maintained by it. This has worked to normalise the oppression or second-class status of certain groups in society. We are reliant on language to think, so its power to guide how we do that is indisputable. It does no harm at all to think about how we use language. It does not require tolerating being told how to use it. Even the much derided concept of microaggressions has validity. People really can find themselves repeatedly encountering seemingly innocent language, which nevertheless assumes they are inferior, inadequate, or an outsider. Imagine having grown up in England and consider yourself to be English, but be constantly asked where you come from because you're not white. The askers surely mean no malice, but couldn't a child feel set apart from her peers if she grows up with this question which is never asked of her white friends? Again, there's nothing wrong with people being made aware of this, of giving it thought. Similarly, the idea that people can be erased by language makes sense to anyone who has ever found themselves left out of an account of something they had a part in. Just last week, the Jewish Chronicle reported that University College Union had left Jews out of its description of people who'd been killed in the Holocaust. Jews can quite reasonably expect that their role in this atrocity not be forgotten. Ultimately, it is not the idea of the power of language that is wrong, but what social justice scholars and activists suggest doing about it. The deeply paranoid and uncharitable reading of other people's language, looking for manifestations of racism, sexism, or homophobia that must be there. The belief that the interpretation and thus the manifestation, and thus the impact of words is more important than intention. The requirement not to say certain things and to say other things. The demands for censorship or no platforming of certain ideas. Denying people the right to hear and engage with them. The rapidly changing dictionary of socially acceptable and unacceptable words. The resulting minefield of potential offence. The weaponisation of that offence and the undermining of resilience. These are all manifestations of the intense and neurotic focus on language in the social justice realm. We see how much this is seeped into UK law when people can be brought in for questioning, for stating a disbelief in trans identity, or expressing scepticism that Islam is a religion of peace. For liberals, the power of language has never been doubted. We're just more optimistic about it. To liberals who value the concept of the marketplace of ideas, language is primarily something that can be used to formulate arguments and advance knowledge and moral progress. As painful as it can be to tolerate ideas which challenge your cherished, deeply held and even sacred beliefs, it is how we progress in both factual knowledge and human rights. The concept of the marketplace of ideas is one which holds that only by allowing the free exchange of ideas can we rid ourselves of the unworthy, fallacious and unethical, and advance the worthy, true and good. Although some may consider this naive, societies which have been open to this free exchange of ideas are indeed the ones with the greatest technological and scientific advance, and the greatest equality. It really is not a coincidence that Western societies advanced so much and so fast when people were allowed to evaluate and compare different ideas, when we could poke holes in received wisdom and demand that it be evidenced. Jonathan Rauch called this process liberal science and argued persuasively that it was this very method which led to such a big leap in acceptance of homosexuality and decrease in anti-Semitism. While it might seem naive to believe that the free expression of ideas and support of viewpoint diversity will always result in greater liberalism, there is no evidence at all that suppressing them does. Social justice activists often claim that liberals who oppose their censorious approach to language either don't recognise or don't care how powerfully it can impact society. They would do well to understand that we'd hardly be arguing so hard for freedom of speech if we didn't know that. There is simply no benefit to being sucked into a false dichotomy in which you can either accept the core tenets of social justice ideas or reject them. Don't be misled into thinking you cannot criticise social justice approaches if you believe that culture has influence, humans have prejudice, and language can hurt. Don't let anyone tell you that the only way to work for a more just society is to support the social justice methods and conceptions of the world. Reject the claims that only social justice ideas can deconstruct grand narratives and recognise the problem of bias and the power of language. This is not remotely true. This is the very essence of liberalism, which predates both postmodernism and social justice, and history bears witness to its success. Similarly, do not fall into the trap of reacting against social justice claims on principle because you don't like their methods. Social justice cannot be advanced if you refuse to ever consider there might be a need for it. Whether you are left-wing or conservative, the only way to draw people away from postmodern ideas in the form of social justice is to convince them that you can do social justice better. I believe we can, and I'm going to keep trying, and I hope you will help. Thank you.